begin. Today, as you can probably see, we're getting into the Intel chips. I talked on the last video, the last tech show, about Apple's chips. Actually, I talked about their cell phones, like the iPhone chips, and how I was like really into those. And so I thought I would, get more in depth into what these processor chips actually, what they are, what they do, and that types of thing. So stick around. So in 1968, Robert Noyce founded the new firm Intel, and in 1971, which was 3 years later, Intel created its first 4-bit microprocessor, and that's the Intel 4, I guess 4004, or however they say it. And then a year later, they had the 8-bit. So immediately they had the 8-bit, the 8008 chip. And if we go ahead and skip to about 1978, that's when we had the 16-bit chip. And then a couple years after that, IBM selected the 16-bit chip to power the IBM PC. So this was the 80s. And, not much changed between the years 81 and 1990. But in 1993, they introduced the Pentium. And, this was kind of a game changer, honestly. Because it was a really fucking powerful chip, man. This was the 32-bit Pentium. And you can see on the screen if you compare see, we'll talk more on clock rate and CPU clock in a second. But right now you can just kind of compare like the clock rates between the two clock speeds. And so you'll see that the 4-bit chip is measured in kilohertz, which is a lot slower. And then the 32-bit chip, and that is in megahertz. And eventually we'll get into gigahertz, which is even faster, which is insane. But I added this picture of a single transistor on here just to get an idea, because so the first chip had about 2,000 transistors, and this chip on the right, the Pentium, says it has 3 million transistors. And if you're into like electronics and shit, you kind of understand what a transistor is, what it does. And so I included a little picture of what one transistor looks like. So there are 3 million of those things inside of the Pentium chip, which is kind of insane from like an electrical standpoint. It's pretty insane to me. So in 2001, they rolled out the Xeon, and the Xeon processor was more for like server-based things. I believe it had a really high CPU, but that was for like server maintenance and just for use with a server. And then 2005, Intel joined Apple, and a year later, they launched the first 64-bit Core 2 Duo series. So that the first 64-bit was in 2006. And I believe that's what we're working on today, is 64-bit CPU. So in the years of 2010 and 2017, Intel launched the Core i3 series. You got the Intel Core i series, sorry. So you have the i3, i5, i7, and there's actually a new one called the i9. But right here, I'll get into what all this stuff means in a second. So starting with the i3, here's some of the code names we have, and Over here we got a list of some of the generations here on the right, and there are about 11 generations right now, I think. This has about 8, but I believe there are 11 generations of the i3. And each i3 chip has 2 cores and features hyper-threading, and the cache is smaller. And we'll get into cache in a second, but the cache is smaller, and many would say it is worse than the i5, but don't be fooled by that, because you would expect the lower chip to not be as powerful as, so you would expect the i5 chip, right, to be more powerful than the i3 chip. But that's not necessarily always the case, as we'll mention in a little bit here. Let's see. So you can see all these code names on here, and yeah, they just, I mean, Intel came up with these, I guess, code names for each processor. You got the Clarkdale, Sandy Bridge, Ivy Bridge, and Skylake, and it's pretty interesting to look at. But so there's this thing called hyper-threading, as Intel calls it, and it's basically simultaneous multi-threading, and really it means that one CPU can work on 2 problems at the same time, and it doesn't mean that the CPU can do twice as much work. It can just work on more problems at the same time. That's kind of, see, I'm reading this from a paper I wrote, but it's kind of confusing. It basically means that one CPU core can work on 2 problems at the same time. It doesn't mean that the CPU can do twice as much work. Huh. Okay. Just that it can ensure all its capacity is used by dealing with multiple simpler problems at once. So the i5 carries all these features along with improved graphics and turbo boost. And Intel Turbo Boost technology is a way to automatically run the processor core faster than the marked frequency. The processor must be working in the power, temperature, and specification limits of the thermal design power, or TDP. This results in increased performance of both single and multi-threaded applications. Now, I know that if you're not really into this stuff, that can be extremely confusing, and it's still sort of confusing to me after doing days of research, so don't let that bother you, because no one completely really, understands these things. They're very, very confusing, the way that Intel designed the name, really the way they named them in all of the releases that they were named. They're just very confusing, and I just wouldn't worry too much about the names and other stuff that's kind of confusing. Like, multi-threading or hyper-threading isn't very confusing. Hyper-threading is just Intel's name for simultaneous multi-threading, but just remember that it doesn't mean the CPU can do twice as much work. It just means one core can work on 2 problems at the same time. And see, that's confusing me right now just to read that. So, but I'll continue. So the i7 usually has more cache, and we'll get into cache in a second, like I've been saying. Faster turbo boost and better graphics than the lower processors. Okay. I don't want to skip ahead, but I don't exactly know what's on the next slide. Fuck it. Yeah, this slide's probably boring to look at right now, so I'll give you this. Let me see. Okay, so now here's where it gets incredibly confusing. Before, you would expect the chip with the higher number to be better or faster one. That's not always the case, like I said. So that's kind of where it gets confusing with like the chip names, names and numbers. But we have specs. Specs aren't as confusing as the chip names and numbers, and specs are a better way to figure out which chip is the best for you. So cache. So we know what RAM does. It's a short-term memory storage for the computer, and it places data that it's currently working on, so it's easily accessible. And I'll get back to this photo in a second. We can look into cache, and then we can look into clock speed. But I want to get actually into explaining what cache really is. So, like I said, RAM, which is that thing on the left, is what a stick of RAM looks like. Very similar to that. So yes, RAM. It like I just said, it stores short-term memory, and the computer places data that it's currently working on in the RAM. So it's easily accessible, and the more RAM a computer has, the more data it can juggle at the same time. Now it's important to know how RAM and CPU cache work together. So the RAM is dynamic, meaning it is constantly refreshing in order to store data. And we call that dynamic RAM. It's dynamic, meaning it's constantly refreshing and getting new information. And the second type of RAM that doesn't have to be constantly refreshed is called static RAM, or CPU cache. So it is faster than the dynamic RAM. So the traditional RAM that you see on the left, the traditional stick of RAM, that's dynamic RAM. And then we have, I don't really have a picture of it, but basically on the chip itself, you can find the SRAM, the static RAM. But there are levels. There are levels to this. As you can see on the right, there are levels to the cache memory. And I'll sort of explain that if you haven't already read a little bit about that. So just one thing to remember, CPU cache is faster than RAM, faster than dynamic RAM, faster than your stick of RAM, but it's also so much more expensive. CPU cache is super expensive. See, the thing about it is it's very fast, but it doesn't have a high storage amount. So that's why we need the RAM. The RAM, you can get up to like 16 gigs, 32 gigs, probably even 64 gigs and higher. So the CPU cache is the CPU's internal memory, and its job is to store copies of data from RAM that's waiting to be used by the CPU. And if that's confusing, it's okay. Just know that the CPU cache is very fast. It doesn't have a high amount of storage. It can only store about, like 20 megabytes, around that. But with a stick of what is it? I want to say dynamic RAM. With the stick of dynamic RAM, it can have a higher amount of storage space. So that's why it's important to have the stick of RAM, because you need more space for memory, So it's sort of an interesting thing because I thought you could just like replace the static RAM. Sorry, I keep confusing myself. I thought you could replace the dynamic RAM with just straight up static RAM because it's so fast. It's like, why would you need the dynamic RAM, right? See, I'm already confusing myself with dynamic and static. So the static RAM is the cache, and the dynamic RAM is the. See, I'll put it in. I have a link here of the question because I'm literally like a little retarded for words right now. I just can't get the words out. So let me just read them from somebody else so this sort of makes sense and I didn't completely lose you. So here we go. Why can't RAM be replaced by cache memory? And this guy says it's all about the memory hierarchy. In general, it's very difficult to make a semiconductor memory which has both a large capacity and a high speed. The former requires a larger physical size, while the latter requires high speed, requires higher power consumption, as well as a high degree of locality. Okay, if you weren't already confused, the main thing is CPU memory is faster and RAM is slower, but it can store more. And that's all I was really trying to say. And I've confused myself and probably you guys too, but don't worry, I'll bring it all back. I will bring it back to you. Okay. So dynamic RAM is just basically RAM. Static RAM, that is the CPU. Okay, enough on the RAM talk because I already lost my mind. So, okay, so the two work together, and like I said, the CPU cache is the CPU's internal memory, and the cache holds data that it thinks the CPU is going to use over and over again. And whenever a CPU needs to access some data, it will check the cache first before checking the slower option, which is the dynamic RAM. Now that we have a grasp of cache, sort of, we can go into more detail. There are 3 levels of cache. Level 1 is usually part of the chip itself and it is the fastest. And level 2 and 3 caches are bigger and they are built between the CPU and the RAM. Level 2 can sometimes be on the chip as well. And then at the bottom I have a photo of CPU and level 1, 2, 3 cache, and then the main memory, which I'm going to say that is dynamic RAM. Okay. Now that you sort of got an idea maybe of what cache is, maybe you don't understand it, but you got an idea. It's storing memory and accessing it quickly. And that's kind of really all that's going on, sort of. So next, we can bring this back up. Now, I promise you clock speed is much more easier to understand than cache, or at least the way I'll describe it is easier. Okay, so let's see here. Clock speed. First, it may help you to know what a clock cycle is. A single electrical pulse in a CPU is a cycle. During the pulse, the CPU can perform a simple task like accessing memory writing data, or getting a new set of instructions to perform. A clock cycle is a single electric pulse. Now, the clock speed may or may not be as important as how many of these instructions your CPU can finish. So your computer is constantly getting instructions on what it's needing to do. So I have a very in-depth article that I found on Intel's website that explains it in easy terms. And I'm going to pull that up and I'm just going to read it. So, what is clock speed? In general, a higher clock speed means a faster CPU. However, many other factors come into play. Your CPU processes many instructions from different programs every second. The clock speed measures the number of cycles your CPU executes per second, measured in gigahertz. A cycle is technically a pulse synchronized by an internal oscillator. But for our purposes, they're a basic unit that helps understand a CPU speed. During each cycle, billions of transistors within the processor open and close. A CPU with a clock speed of 3.2 gigahertz executes 3.2 billion cycles per second. So here's a photo of the waves that a cycle of a cycle. So up at the top you have 6 hertz, and that would be 6 cycles, and then you see 12 hertz, and then you see 25 hertz, which is 25 cycles. And so that's only in hertz. Just imagine putting that in kilohertz, which is times 1,000, or megahertz, or gigahertz. So 3.2 gigahertz is 3.2 billion cycles per second. And just that's fucking insane. So sometimes multiple instructions are completed in a single clock cycle. In other cases, one instruction might be handled over multiple clock cycles. Since different CPU designs handle instructions differently, it's best to compare clock speeds within the same CPU brand and generation. For example, a CPU with a higher clock speed from 5 years ago might be outperformed by a new CPU with a lower clock speed, as the newer architecture deals with instructions more efficiently. An X series Intel processor might outperform a K series processor with a higher clock speed because it splits tasks between more cores and features a larger CPU cache. So that kind of goes back on what I was saying earlier. It splits tasks between cores. So that part where I said, what exactly did I say? Sorry, I have to find it. The part where it's not exactly faster. Okay, here it is. So, hyperthreading. It basically means that one CPU core can work on 2 problems at the same time. It doesn't mean the CPU can do twice as much work, just that it can ensure all capacity is used by dealing with multiple simpler problems at once. Huh. Wow. I'm sort of getting it slowly. Okay, sorry. Getting back to this. Within the same generation of CPUs, a processor with a higher clock speed will generally outperform a processor with a lower clock speed across many applications. This is why it's important to compare processors from the same brand and generation. And they got this video about gaming. I don't know if it's worth anything to watch it. I don't want to steal their sound. But see, it's more of just like explaining, kind of like what I'm doing, but in a visual way. So yeah, I mean, basically what I'm saying is what's in the video. So how does clock speed affect gaming? So if you're a gamer. Before the advent of multi-core CPUs, clock speed was viewed as a key spec for comparing single-core processors. Today it's taken into consideration alongside number of cores, CPU cache, and power consumption. What the hell? So, this next part is where the beefy, interesting stuff comes in. The impact of clock speed on an individual game depends on the game's engine and the tools used to create it. Benchmarking sites like Tom's Hardware have found that some game engines like Far Cry's Primal benefit more from strong single thread performances than multi-threading. On the other hand, many newer AAA games, especially in multi-threading friendly engines like Unreal Engine 4, can benefit both from extra cores and increased clock. These are very long-winded sentences, so you sort of lose what you're saying halfway through, especially if you're listening, probably. Specific benchmarks are the best way to assess CPU performance in a particular game engine, but clock speed is a good general guide to the relative performance of processors within a product family. What is turbo frequency? I'll just read this quickly. Turbo boost technology is a tool that enhances clock speed dynamically. There's that word again, dynamically, which means there's a surge of, there's a pulse. It has to be refreshed every so often. Clock speed dynamically to deal with heavy workloads. It works without requiring any installation or configuration by the user. The technology judges the amount of thermal headroom the processor has, as well as the number of cores in use, and then boosts the clock speed to maximum safe level. So which number is more important for gaming? The turbo frequency. Given adequate cooling, this is the speed your CPU will operate when dealing with heavy workloads, such as traveling through a city, cyberpunk, or calculating the AI behavior on an enemy turn in a strategy game in most CPU-intensive titles. How do you adjust it? Well, the term overclocking refers to speeding up the CPU clock for more processing power. Intel CPUs with a K in the name have unlocked multiplier for easy overclocking when paired with a motherboard chipset that supports overclocking. So with overclocking, you get higher FPS. And yeah, that's what you get. So why does clock speed matter? CPU clock speed is a good indicator of your processor's performance, though applications like video editing and streaming are known to rely on multi-core performance. Many new video games still benchmark best on CPUs with the highest clock speed. So clock speed is different than what your computer can actually do. So how many processes it can do is separate from the clock speed. Now that's confusing, but it makes sense. So like I said, the computer speed may or may not be as important as how many of these instructions your CPU can finish. So the higher clock speed isn't necessarily the faster one, though it's generally a good indicator of which one to buy. So pull this back up. And so you can see the clock speed, the multiplier, the bus speed, and that kinds of things, along with the cache. With the cache, you got the level 1 data, the level 2 data, level 3. And you'll see the cache right here, level 1 data's got about 232 kilobyte for memory, and that's fucking nothing. And level 3's got 4 megabytes. That's literally nothing. So comparing that to a 32 gigabyte piece of RAM, so the cache really just pulls what is in the RAM really fast. So the more RAM you have, the more shit can be stored in it. And then the higher the CPU cache, the more the instructions can be pulled and then used. So that sort of makes sense. If you're really into this stuff, you can look it up. I'll recommend this guy's video real quick. He makes a ton of YouTube videos. I won't play them because I don't want to, like, it's someone else's shit. But this guy, his name is I hope you didn't hear that. Stupid advertisement. Actually, you didn't hear it, thank God. Okay. I'm not on my premium account, so I can't show you. But this guy's video right here, he sort of explains it. You can check out his video. It makes a ton of sense. So you got your DRAM, SRAM. And yeah, this is a really good video. There's also one more, clock speed explained. I watched another one of these videos. I think it's this one. This guy's video right here. He's got a really nice video that explains it. If I can find it. So here's how he explains the core speed. So 100 megahertz, which is the bus speed, divided by the base speed, which is very confusing. But then you multiply that by the multiplier, and then you get your core speed. And yeah, I mean, it's sort of not so confusing once you look at it, but I do recommend this guy's video. Those two videos are recommended. So that's Max's Tech. So yeah, that's really all I have for today. Just wanted to talk a little bit about CPUs, and I sort of understand them a little bit better. And maybe you got some understanding as well, but they're not really easy to understand at first, you know. It doesn't always click right away, but it will. Just don't get too caught up on the names and the different Intel chip numbers, because you'll just get lost that way. Focus on stuff like clock speed, number of cores, and CPU cache, which is more or less the real important stuff. So I hope you guys enjoyed this tech show, and I'll be back with some more. Hopefully the next one won't be so confusing. But I do hope you got something out of this. And check out the rest of my channel. I do a podcast on there. And I'll talk to you guys soon. Peace.